Without intervention, without this restoration project, this creek would never go back to its natural state of being.
In 2005, Arizona did something almost no power company in America ever does. It shut down a fully working 96-year-old dam and just walked away. No lawsuit forced it. No disaster caused it. A creek that had been squeezed to a trickle since 1909 was suddenly given every drop of its water back all at once. What happened next stunned the scientists who had spent years preparing for it.
Really cool to see the salmon return in late July and early August and see them in there using the new features of the channel as they should be and that they didn't have before. So it's pretty cool.
Fish populations exploded more than 100 times over. Solid rock started forming out of water again, in real time. This is the story of the fastest, strangest river recovery in American history. A creek that builds its own stone. The creek is called Fossil Creek, and the name is a small joke the landscape plays on everyone who visits. There are no dinosaur bones here. What early travelers found were twigs, leaves, and stones wrapped in a pale shell, as if they'd turned to rock on the spot. They weren't fossils. They were travertine, a form of limestone the water itself deposits as it moves. Fossil Creek doesn't carry ordinary water. It carries water so loaded with dissolved calcium that it builds solid rock wherever the current slows down. The source is a cluster of springs at the base of a 1,600-foot canyon in central Arizona, and they are the reason any of this exists at all. Those springs push out around 20,000 gallons every minute, a steady 43 cubic feet per second, in drought and in flood, at a constant 70 to 72 degrees all year long. Sit with that number for a second. In a state defined by dry washes and rivers that vanish by midsummer, that kind of reliability is almost impossible. The water simply appears out of the rock, and it never stops. Where that flow slows against a fallen log or a bend in the channel, the calcium hardens into pale ledges of stone, sealing sticks and leaves inside them. Over centuries, this built terraces and natural dams across the streambed, holding back pools that glow in almost unreal turquoise in the desert light. That endless flow built the most diverse riparian corridor in Arizona. More than 30 species of trees and shrubs, more than 100 species of birds moving through the canyon each year, and roughly 13 tons of fresh travertine laid down along the creek every single day. That rate makes Fossil Creek the fourth largest travertine system in the United States, behind only Mammoth Hot Springs, Havasu Creek, and the Blue Springs of the Little Colorado. Long before any of this became a research site, it was simply home. Archaeologists have traced human presence in this watershed back perhaps 10,000 years. Yavapai and Apache peoples lived beside the creek for generations, and they still regard the canyon as ancestral ground. In a region where most streams run dry by midsummer, a spring this consistent made the canyon something close to sacred ground, a fixed point of water and life in a landscape that offers very few of them. What happened to this water in the 20th century and what it took to bring it back is the story this channel exists to tell. The travertine itself is worth pausing on because it's the clearest signal of whether this creek is healthy or not. It doesn't form just anywhere. It needs steady, moving, mineral-saturated water, exactly the kind these springs have produced for millennia. Cut that flow, even partially, and the process stalls almost immediately. Restore it, and the process restarts almost as fast. This creek keeps a physical record of its own condition, laid down one thin layer of stone at a time. That record is what makes everything that follows so easy to verify. There's one more character worth introducing early, because everything that happens later depends on her. Years before anyone shut a valve, a conservation ecologist named Dr. Jane Marks at Northern Arizona University positioned a team of scientists on Fossil Creek to do something restoration projects almost never get to do: measure a river in detail before it changes. Marks and her team tracked the starved creek's chemistry, its fish, its stone building, against a healthy reference stretch upstream that still ran at full flow. They didn't know exactly what they'd find when the water came back, but they made sure that whatever happened, they'd have the numbers to prove it. If stories like this one interest you, the ones about American rivers getting a second chance while almost nobody's watching, go ahead and subscribe now. This channel covers those quiet comebacks regularly, and you won't want to miss where this one goes. The dam that powered Phoenix. In 1900, a rancher named Lou Turner filed a claim on the creek's water. A year later, he claimed the springs themselves. It looked like a small filing. It wasn't. The mining towns nearby, Jerome, Clarkdale, Crown King, were hungry for electricity, and a spring that never stopped flowing looked, to the thinking of that era, like a resource going to waste. Turning that vision into a power plant meant building a road where none existed. The nearest railroad stop sat more than 40 miles away, across mountains and canyon country, with no route through it at all. So, the crews built one. More than 400 mules and 600 men, most of them Apache and Mojave laborers, hauled turbines and cement over that 40-mile trail into a canyon that dropped 1,600 feet from rim to water. Some of them didn't survive the trail. A $1.5 million bond issue, an enormous sum for 1908, financed the effort, and on June 21, 1909, the Childs power plant came online, named for the bond broker who financed it. A second plant, Irving, followed a few years later, named for the financier behind that round of funding. Together, they pulled the creek through 8,800 feet of flumes, and a 25-foot dam near the springs captured nearly the entire stream. At the time, this looked like nothing but progress. By 1920, Childs and Irving together supplied roughly 70% of the electricity for booming Phoenix. Streetlights, streetcars, and the valley's first air conditioners drew current, in part, from water that had welled up in a limestone canyon 100 miles away. The plants earned real distinction over the decades, named a historic mechanical engineering landmark in 1976 and added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1991. But below the dam, the creek was a ghost of itself. Downstream of the springs, the flow sometimes dropped to 1 or 2 cubic feet per second, where the natural flow should have been 43 or more. Travertine, which needs moving water to grow, stopped forming along long stretches of channel. The famous pools shrank, and some disappeared entirely, replaced by cracked mineral flats where turquoise water had once stood. Native fish, species that existed nowhere else on Earth, were squeezed into a fraction of their old habitat, and non-native bass and other introduced species slipped in behind them, preying on the natives and outcompeting them for what little water and food remained. For a creek whose entire identity was built on turning water into stone, that was a slow disaster, unfolding in silence for most of a century, while the plants above kept running and the power kept flowing to Phoenix. The utility that chose to let go, by the 1990s, the arithmetic had shifted. Childs and Irving were old, and by the standards of a modern grid, nearly irrelevant, generating a rounding error's worth of power compared to what they had produced in 1920. Environmental groups, including the Center for Biological Diversity, argued that the diversion had wrecked rare travertine formations, shrunk critical wetlands, and pushed native species toward collapse. Arizona Public Service, the utility that owned the plants, weighed the cost of relicensing and rebuilding century-old infrastructure against the trickle of power it still produced. On paper, it wasn't a close call. In practice, few utilities in the country had ever chosen to walk away from a working dam. In 1999, the company made a decision that stunned conservationists used to losing fights exactly like this one. Arizona Public Service agreed to decommission both plants and return Fossil Creek's full flow to its natural course. No court forced this. The utility chose to give the river back. In a state where water is the single most contested resource there is, a company voluntarily surrendering 20,000 gallons a minute was almost unheard of. It was only the second time in U.S. history a dam had been dismantled purely for environmental reasons. The first, 6 years earlier, was the Edwards Dam in Maine, removed to open a path for commercially valuable fish. Fossil Creek was different. The suckers, dace, and chub this restoration was meant to save had no market value at all. This was restoration for its own sake, and it came with a price tag near $13 million. The decision carried weight beyond kilowatts, especially for the Yavapai Apache Nation, whose ancestors had helped build the very dam now being dismantled. At the ceremony marking the eBay shutdown, tribal historian and councilman Vincent Randall spoke. His people had built the dam, he said. They had been proud of it. But its time had passed, and he asked the creek for forgiveness. Clearing the way. You cannot simply flip a river back on and hope for the best. By 2004, the stretch below the dam was thick with non-native fish, poised to multiply the instant full flow returned and finish off the very natives the whole project was meant to save. So, in the fall of 2004, close to 100 people, working with the Forest Service, Arizona Game and Fish, and scientists from Northern Arizona University, cleared the creek of its invaders and built a barrier to keep them from swimming back upstream. Strip out what didn't belong, hold the line. Then, for the first time in nearly a century, give the native fish back the one thing they'd been denied. Then came the day itself. On June 18, 2005, Arizona Public Service shut off the flume feeding its power plants. For the first time since 1909, the full weight of Fossil Springs ran down its own canyon. It didn't arrive as a wall of water. It came slowly, almost politely, feeling its way into every pool and side channel while scientists and locals stood and watched it come. No desert stream in the American Southwest had ever been handed its full natural flow back like this. Nobody, including the scientists who had spent years preparing, was entirely sure what would happen next. The numbers. Nobody expected Dr. Marks and her team had their reference data ready and waiting. That's what made what came next so easy to measure and so hard to believe. Photosynthesis in the stream climbed almost immediately. The creek's capacity to process nutrients returned to levels matching the healthy reference reach upstream, not in decades, but in seasons. Marks had braced her team for a slow recovery. Instead, they watched core ecosystem functions snap back into place almost at once. The stone told the same story. Along starved stretches of channel, travertine building had sat dormant for decades. Once the flow returned, it started again almost immediately. New travertine dams rose along a 6-mile run below the springs, some growing more than 2 centimeters a year. Water was turning back into rock at a measurable pace, and the turquoise pools that had defined this canyon for millennia began to refill and deepen. Marks would later note something unusual about this project. It was the only dam decommissioning in the world where a team this broad, hydrologists, fish biologists, and stream chemists working side by side, had studied both the cost of the damage and the benefit of the recovery in real time, on the same river, with the same before and after data. Most restoration projects don't get that kind of documentation. This one did, almost by accident, because Marks had shown up early. Then came the fish. With the invaders gone, the barrier holding and full flow restored, the native species clinging to survival didn't just recover, they exploded. Sonora suckers multiplied roughly 17-fold. Desert suckers climbed about 52-fold. The round-tailed chub, a fish that had been circling local extinction, came back close to 70-fold. And the speckled dace, an unglamorous native minnow nobody outside the field had ever heard of, increased on the order of 150-fold. Sit with that last number. A population that had nearly vanished from the canyon came back more than 100 times over in the span of a few years. Today, Fossil Creek holds 9 native fish species and a distinction no other stretch of river in Arizona can claim, the longest reach in the state where the native fish community is completely free of non-native competitors. By 2009, the recovery had gone so well that Arizona opened its first catch-and-release native fish season, built around the round-tailed chub, the same species that had nearly disappeared a few years earlier. A river too loved. The recovery didn't stop at the waterline. The restored corridor now supports close to 200 species of birds, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians, including sensitive species like the southwestern willow flycatcher and the Chiricahua leopard frog. In the 50-acre botanical area around the springs alone, researchers have cataloged 166 plant species. A creek that had been quietly dying below its dam had become one of the richest pockets of life in the Southwest. Recognition followed. In March 2009, Congress designated nearly 17 miles of Fossil Creek as a wild and scenic river, one of only 2 in all of Arizona to hold that protection. In a handful of years, this creek went from an industrial water source drained for turbines to a federally protected river held up as a model for restoration projects worldwide. But success created a problem nobody had planned for. Word spread about a place with warm, clear, turquoise water in the middle of the high desert, and the crowds followed. Thousands of visitors a year began pouring into the canyon, trampling banks and straining the very ecosystem the restoration had rebuilt. A river that had survived a hydroelectric empire was now being worn down by people in water shoes carrying coolers. The response has been a tightening system of Forest Service permits, capping how many vehicles can enter the canyon each day. Visitors now reserve a parking spot weeks in advance, sometimes competing for a handful of slots the moment they open, for a river that a generation ago almost nobody bothered to visit at all. Rangers who once patrolled a nearly empty canyon now spend their days managing traffic, trash, and erosion along trails that were never built to handle this much foot traffic. Jane Marks put the goal plainly: shift Fossil Creek from a party spot back into what it actually is, an ecologically important place. The irony is hard to miss. Having saved the creek from being drained, its stewards now have to save it from being loved too much. In 1909, a crew at the bottom of this canyon believed they were building the future. For nearly 100 years, they weren't entirely wrong. That dam helped light up Phoenix, but the deeper future belonged to the water they diverted, not the concrete they built to hold it back. Most of that concrete is gone now. The springs are still running exactly as they have for thousands of years, 20,000 gallons a minute, turning water back into stone. One decision to stop taking and to let a river simply be a river rebuilt one of the most remarkable ecosystems in America, and did it faster than the scientists who studied it thought was possible. What makes Fossil Creek different from most restoration stories isn't just the speed of the recovery, it's the proof. Because Jane Marks got her instruments in the water years before the valve turned, this isn't a case where people are guessing at what the dam cost the river or hoping the comeback is as dramatic as it looks. The before and after sits side by side in the data, and it says the same thing the fish counts say, and the same thing the travertine says: give the water back and the river does the rest. The story of Fossil Creek suggests that some of the most powerful things we can do for the natural world aren't the things we build, they're the things we choose to undo. If you want more of these quiet, unlikely comebacks, the ones happening in canyons and forests while nobody's watching, subscribe and stick around. There's a lot of wild left in America worth paying attention to.